Hello everyone and welcome back to the Road to Chess Master. Today is going to be a very exciting game because it's the final round of this tournament, and if I get a draw or if I get a win, then I end up getting a National Master norm, something that is required for me to get the National Master title in Canada. Speaking of National Master, that's exactly the title my opponent holds, so this is not going to be an easy one, especially since I'm playing with the black pieces. I did a little bit of preparation before the game, and I saw that my opponent liked to play the move knight to f3. At the time, this was a little bit worrying for me, because if they end up playing this move, I might be unable to play against the various systems they'll try to throw at me. For example, if you play in this position, d5, but against d4 you play knight to f6 and you avoid d5, then all of a sudden, if you play knight f3, d5, there's d4, and white has successfully transposed into a position you may not play. Alternatively, the reason why knight f3 is so special is because it's not just to transpose into a d4 opening. You can also play into c4 as well. For example, if you don't play the move d5 against c4, then c4 could be played here, and you have to learn something entirely new against it. Maybe you're a c4, c5 player, but again, after knight f3, d5, and c4, you might find yourself in trouble. Luckily for me, at the time, I was playing d5 against pretty much anything that black did aside from e4. So here, against c4, I could play c6. This transposes into the semi-Slav after d4 and knight f6. Alternatively, d4 isn't really scary for me either because I was playing knight to f6 at the time here as well, where if c4 then c6, everything is working for me here. The problem is I actually don't really like playing the semi-Slav, and I really didn't at the time. It's a pretty difficult opening to play, where white has a lot of different setups that they can try, and usually there's a lot of little tricks involved, where if black doesn't actually know what's going on, then you can lose quite quickly, and sometimes it's really hard to know exactly what is going on. But because this is my repertoire, I have to play it. If they go knight f3, I will go d5. Now with that all out of the way, we know my plan. So if they play knight f3, at least I have an idea of what I'm doing. And they played knight f3, so I played d5, and after g3, I played g6. My opponent could have potentially gotten something here with d4. The reasoning behind doing this now is actually I don't play g6 systems at all in these positions, so maybe there's something that they could take advantage of here. But instead, they decide to play bishop to g2. But why did I play g6? It's actually because after bishop g7 in this position, white might feel forced to play d4, otherwise I'm going to get e5 in and I'm going to have a nice center. White actually does ignore this in this game and castles instead. I continue with my plan of e5, just gaining as much space as possible in the center, and after d3, I go knight to c6. Now, white pretty much has to make a pawn break at this moment, and there's two of them possible, either e4 or c4, but one of them's good and one of them is a little bit silly. If you go c4 after the trade and even taking on d1, black's probably fine here. This is a little bit silly to play. But after e4, there might be a little bit more play in the position than what I had thought at the time. Of course, black's natural way to play is going to be to take on e4, where after white recaptures, there's a queen trade. I mean, this is pretty nice to see, especially for someone that only needs a draw. And the position is probably around even, especially after the move bishop to g4. White actually might feel like they're under a little bit of pressure here. Currently, the threat is something to do with taking on f3 or going knight to d4. For example, h3 loses the game thanks to bishop takes f3, knight to d4, attacking c2, and f3. They can only defend one of the two, and because of that, they're going to be losing material here. Luckily though, white does have c3. This is a very good response. It just prevents knight to d4 altogether. And after knight to f6, this is where my preparation ended and where my opponent played a pretty natural move that I just wasn't ready for. h3, kicking the bishop. Now, you want to go to e6, but I was a little bit afraid here. Knight g5 looks a little annoying. I'd have to maybe move my bishop again, say bishop to d7. Turns out this isn't actually so bad. I can play h6 and then bring my bishop back to e6 in time. Instead, I psyched myself out way too much and played bishop to d7 immediately, and I consider this a mistake, but it's definitely not the only one I made this game, and it's certainly not the biggest one. They continued with knight to d2, and then I castled long. And now knight to g5, I can easily meet with something like rook to f8, so I'm not really too worried about this f7 pawn falling. Instead, my opponent played b3 with the idea of developing this bishop on c1, and now I actually have the opportunity to go bishop to e6. It might feel like h6 is the better move, and this is what I played in the game, but bishop e6 has a nice point to it. If knight to g5 now, I can go bishop to h6, and there's a little bit of a problem for white. If they take this bishop, they do get the bishop pair momentarily, but after f takes, there's going to be a few problems for them. First off, they are pinned on the d file, and they can't move off of it without losing a piece. So what do they do exactly? The top move is rook to b1. That's a little bit of a hard one to find. But the point is, if I play something slow like rook to d7, then there's rook to b2, rook h to d8, and eventually they'll be able to move their king over and then the knight away without any problems. So rook d7 is not the answer, but there is still a little bit of an advantage here for black, and it turns out the move is rook to d3. Now the c3 pawn is hanging, and this actually has to be addressed, but it also probably shouldn't be at all. Bishop f1 might be the best move. Here's why. If they defend with something like c4, now there's rook h to d8. Black is actually winning here. The reason why is because rook to b2, a defense that did work before, no longer does, thanks to rook to c3. The simple move wins the game because you are going to take on c1 and then take on d2 next. For example, h4, now we can take on c1, rook takes c1 and bishop takes, or rook takes on d2. We can see that after the trade, for example, and rook to d1, we have two pieces for the rook, and here there's no compensation for white, so black is winning. Though of course that line is pretty complicated, so it's pretty understandable why I didn't go for anything like that. But just the principle that the bishop belonged on e6 all along, even here, is kind of telling that I didn't understand the positions as I maybe should have. After h6, we see bishop to b2. They're ready to play c4 at some point, or something else, which we actually see in the game. I go bishop e6, finally getting that bishop on the e6 square. Clearly the best square for it. It's just a little bit more active. It opens up my rook on the d file, so what's not to love? And now my opponent plays a pretty impressive move. Bishop to f1. This bishop was not really doing too much on this diagonal, so they play bishop f1 with the idea that now it's covering a new one. But it's not quite threatening to go there yet. If they go too early, h3 might hang, or I might be able to kick it at some point with some sort of knight b8 and a6. So they have to be careful. But again, this is another position where I didn't really assess that it wasn't that bad if this happens. When they played bishop to f1, I decided to play a6. I wanted to avoid bishop to b5. Maybe it's not necessary, but it's not also a bad move here. My opponent played rook to e1 because this knight wants to maybe move at some point, but also it's tethered to this e4 pawn, so it's kind of hard to do anything there without defending e4 first. I go knight to d7 with the idea of rerouting. Maybe I'm going from c5 to d3 to try to win the bishop pair, or maybe I'm just going knight to b6 since it's closer to my king and I might feel a little bit safer. Another benefit is that it also opens up my bishop a little bit and also prepares me to play something like f6 to defend e5 further. Now here's where things start to go wrong for me. My opponent plays b4. And I was incredibly scared by this move because it's about to attack my king. I felt like they were getting their attack and mine was nowhere in sight. But the queens are traded. These things matter a lot less than if the queens were still on the board. b5 would be a very big threat. But as the moment stands, my move in the game doesn't make much sense. I played knight c to b8 in order to prepare against the move b5. But again, it wasn't really a threat. A better move was a5, where if b5 now, I'm actually incredibly happy here because after knight to b8, eventually I can play something like b6, this knight to c5, and then the other knight over to d7, and all of my pieces find good squares. The best move is supposed to be a3, but after knight b6, a4, and then f6, surprisingly, black is doing totally fine. This tension looks bad because when there's tension in front of your king, it means that you have to be incredibly careful of when your opponent is able to open it up with an advantage, or when they're not able to, but I wasn't even looking in this direction anyways. The problem with knight c to b8 is it's just passive, and I'm kind of giving the game to my opponent now, and this is a really bad sign, and unfortunately, it also means you might know the results. I wasn't actually able to survive, and it's just going to be downhill from here because I get into pretty much an entirely passive position and nearly in Zugzwang at the end. My opponent played a4 to continue potentially attacking on the king side. I played g5 with the idea that I want to play f6, but knight h4 might be annoying, so g5 prevents knight h4, so f6 can come next, and then I can develop my bishop on this diagonal instead. The problem is, that diagonal's not really too useful, especially with the way they push their pawns. Knight c4 was played, I played f6 just to defend e5, and then we see knight to e3. They're maneuvering all of their pieces to the right squares. Now they're looking at f5 and d5, and I don't really want to take because this bishop is quite a good piece, but I also might have to. h5 was played by me. I'm just trying to create some sort of play on this side of the board, maybe something with g4 or even h4. And then we see a5, and then I go bishop to h6. My idea here was that if I could play g4, I'd be a little bit happier because maybe I could take on e3, and then some of the pressure would be resolved. For example, rook to d1, g4 takes, and then I take on e3, rook takes, and then pawn takes pawn. This isn't actually so bad, at least from a visual standpoint, because maybe I might double on this file instead, and now I have a little bit of play for myself. Or maybe I don't do that at all, and I play something like knight f8 to g6 and just try to trade some rooks off. But my opponent played knight to f5, and this avoids it entirely. So I bring my bishop back because I didn't want them to just take, even though it actually is not such a bad thing. And then bishop to c1. Now the threats just keep coming and coming, and it's really hard to play here. So I played a really weird move, rook to e8. I'm just trying to essentially shuffle and see what my opponent's trying to do, hoping they commit to something and that it might not work out. Another idea I might have here is to take on f5 and then maybe push e4. But it doesn't really make sense to because they would get the d4 square. They continue with bishop to d2, and now I make probably the biggest mistake of the game. I'm incredibly passive, all of my pieces are on pretty bad squares, and now after c6, I have created too many weaknesses and the game is over. All they need to do is exploit these squares, mainly d6, but potentially also b6 and also e6, as we'll see. Now, how exactly will they exploit e6? Well, I kind of give it to them. Because after bishop to e3, rook to h7, trying to eventually maybe, sort of, try to get to the d file somehow in the future, knight to d2, h4, g4, and at this point, I feel the need to take on f5. Maybe it's the wrong decision, but I was also finding it hard to even make a legal move at this point, and my opponent does have continuous ways to put pressure on my position. For example, something like knight to c4 and doubling up on the d file. With bishop takes f5, things are completely over, even though they were also kind of completely over before, because after e takes, now the knight can come to e4, the bishop can come to c4 and then e6, and they're going to double up on the d file. And this is exactly what happens in this game. I went rook d8, hoping maybe I can use the d file. We see knight e4, I go bishop e7, and then after rook e to d1 and rook h to h8, my opponent plays a surprising move. I would recommend pausing the video and trying to find a way to continue this position as white, because I think it's a very instructive one. Normally, you're going to compare your pieces versus your opponent's, and when you see that you have a good piece, you generally don't want to trade it for one of your opponent's bad ones, but that's not all that you should think about in a position. Again, it's not quite just what happens when a piece has come off the board, it's about what stays on. And with knight to d6, white is winning. The point here is that after I trade, Then rook takes d6 comes, and rook to d1 is a pretty big threat too. It's impossible to pretty much move this knight, because if I do, then this pawn will fall, and also bishop to b6 might be a problem. And not just that, but there's also bishop c4 to e6 coming soon. So it's actually a really good move because it gets rid of one of my important defensive pieces. And that's actually why I played king to c7, giving up the exchange. This loses too after knight f7, rook to f8, and then they just take the exchange. There's nothing wrong with that. I was considering rook takes for a while with the idea of maybe trying to trade off one of the rooks. This is probably the right approach strategically because it'll be harder to use this file if only one rook can get in. But I played bishop takes instead because I was worried about some sort of bishop to b6. For example, rook takes d8, rook d2. If I'm not careful and play something like knight f8, offering a trade, bishop to b6 check will win another exchange, and this game is once again finished. So bishop takes was played, and this also does have the attempt of potentially improving the piece with king c7 and bishop c7, and we see that here with rook to d8, king c8, and then bishop c4, bishop c7. But after bishop e6, I'm close to resigning and almost due very soon. I go rook e8, attacking the bishop, but not really threatening anything. They go rook to d1, and then I go rook to e7. And now it's time to pause once again and try to find the move that pretty much puts black in a zugzwang and just threatens to win material, but you can't really avoid it anyways. The hint is we are perfectly defending d7. So you need to remove a defender of d7. It's not really so obvious how you can until you see bishop to a7. And there's nothing that can be done. This bishop is going to capture this knight, and once that happens, they're going to be winning material. If we could somehow get out of the pin, then we could play knight takes on b8, but because our bishop is in the way, we can't do this. For example, if we try king to d8, then they take on b8, and then take on d7, we can clearly see that white is winning because they're up a rook, and instead, if we do anything else, they're still taking on b8, because it removes a defender, and this knight can't capture because it's pinned to my king. A pretty brutal game, but it was a pretty instructive one as well. My opponent found really good moves, and I was just playing passively. I wasn't finding good ways to continue my position, and I was creating weaknesses and not going for positions that I didn't really assess as being okay for me. For example, playing a move like bishop to e6 instead of bishop to d7. I genuinely think, even though that wasn't really a massive mistake, it does go back to that because that shows a lack of understanding in these positions and shows exactly where I can improve for next time. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I will see you all with the next one where we start a new tournament. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.